I am archivist third-tier Sorven of the Consolidated Memory Halls assigned to the restricted vault on the 14th sublevel. I am making this record because the mandate requires it. When a species is removed from the catalog of the living, circumstances must be preserved. Someone must write it down. I was there. I will write it down. The Vorath came to us 42 cycles before the end of their civilization. I remember the delegation clearly. 7 senior Vorath, tall. Their ridge plates colored the deep amber of political authority. Their lead speaker was a female called Thress. She had 3 assistants behind her and a legal attaché at her side, and she placed a formal petition on my processing table as if she were filing a trade dispute. The petition requested that the restricted cartographic register be amended. Specifically, she wanted the blank sector removed. She meant human space. I told her what I was required to tell her. I read the designation aloud. Forbidden Zone, designation null 7, survey abandoned. I told her the history. 41 species had approached the border over the cataloged record. 40 had not returned. 1 had returned centuries ago, and the survivor's testimony had been sealed under Vault Clearance Black. I told her that the cartographers of the 6th age had not drawn the blank sector out of ignorance. They had drawn it because the alternative was to label it truthfully, and a truthful label would have caused a different kind of panic. Thress was unmoved. She told me that mythology was not cartography. She told me that the galaxy had permitted a fiction to calcify into law, and that the Vorath Expansion Authority had every legal right to survey unclaimed space. She used the phrase unclaimed space 3 times in the span of an hour. I noticed each time. I did not correct her. It is not my role to correct. My role is to preserve and to testify, and eventually to seal. I referred the petition upward. It reached the 2nd tier in 4 days, and the Chamber of Senior Archivists in 8. The chamber debated for 11 days, longer than most petitions receive, and they found, as I expected they would find, that no legal provision existed to deny the Vorath the right of survey. The blank sector carried no formal interdiction. It carried only a designation and a notation reading "Do not proceed," which is advisory, not binding. They granted the petition. I want to be precise about what happened next, because precision is the only dignity I can offer to what was, in the end, a catastrophe the language of archiving does not entirely accommodate. The Vorath Expansion Authority dispatched a preliminary survey fleet of 9 vessels, mapping ships, not military. They crossed the cartographic boundary at a 0.3 sectors above the ecliptic, a region the old charts marked with a marginal notation in the angular script of the 6th age. I had read that notation many times. It translates, roughly as, "Here, the riders come quickly." Most of my colleagues took it for a navigational warning about stellar drift or debris. I had never been entirely certain that was the right interpretation. None of the 9 ships returned. This was not by itself proof of anything. Ships disappear, navigation errors, drive failures, uncharted gravitational events. There are explanations that do not require the blank sector to mean what the blank sector has always meant. The Vorath Expansion Authority understood this. They sent a 2nd fleet, larger this time, 22 vessels, including 6 with military-grade shielding, because, by then, the Vorath High Council had begun to suspect that some territorial power occupied the sector, and they wanted the survey to proceed with appropriate protection. None of the 22 returned. Now there was silence for a while. Not the silence of deliberation, the silence of something else. I have sat in this vault for many years, and I know the difference between the silence of a bureaucracy thinking and the silence of a bureaucracy afraid to think. What followed the 2nd Fleet's disappearance was the second kind. The High Council met in closed session for 30 days. Their records were not submitted to our archive. They are, I am told, lost, which I find I do not believe. At the end of those 30 days, they made a decision that I believe was the worst decision made by any governing body in the history of the species I have studied in this vault. They decided that the disappearances represented a challenge to Vorath sovereignty. They decided that whatever occupied that sector had committed an act of aggression by destroying survey vessels, conducting legal operations in unclaimed space. They decided that a response was appropriate, a proportional response. Response scaled to demonstrate that the Vorath did not retreat from aggression. I filed 17 objections over the course of that deliberation. They are in the record. I note them here because the record shows that someone said no. That matters to me more than I can properly explain. The Vorath mobilized their war fleet. I will not write the number of ships. It is in the supplemental record if anyone needs it, and anyone who opens this vault and reads this far will have clearance to find it. I will say only that it was not a small number. It was the largest single military deployment the Vorath had made in 300 cycles. Thress, the legal attaché who had stood at my processing table with her petition and her phrase unclaimed, was appointed as civilian liaison to the fleet command. I learned this detail later from a secondary source, and I have not verified it. Include it because I keep thinking about her standing at that table, certain that mythology was not cartography. The fleet crossed the boundary. 41 days later, a single piece of wreckage drifted back across the line. I am not going to describe what was on the hull of that wreckage. I am not going to describe the condition of the flight recorder that was extracted from it, or the contents of that recorder, or what the analysis team reported to the chamber, because the chamber sealed those findings under vault clearance. Black and I am not authorized to reproduce sealed material in an open testimony. I will say that the analysis team filed their report in 11 minutes. 11 minutes. I have been an archivist for 37 years. Analysis teams do not file in 11 minutes. They file in 11 minutes when they have seen something that they do not wish to sit with any longer than is required. The chamber convened the next morning and made the following determinations, which I am authorized to record. The Vorath military expedition had been met with a response. The response had been total. No vessels had escaped the engagement zone. No distress signals had been received at any relay station within 4 sectors of the boundary. The engagement, if it could be called an engagement, the chamber was careful about that word. They used it provisionally, had been brief. The chamber did not specify what brief meant in temporal terms. I did not ask. The Vorath High Council received this report and did not convene again. They could not convene again. By the time the chamber's communication reached Vorath space, the High Council no longer existed, which is a formal way of saying that the Vorath no longer existed in any form that constitutes a civilization, or a species, or a recoverable population. The how of that is also sealed. I am recording this testimony in the present moment, is to say 49 cycles after the petition was filed at my table by a diplomat who used the phrase unclaimed space 3 times in 1 hour. I have been asked by the senior archivist to prepare this testimony for the vault. He told me to be thorough. I have tried to be thorough, tried to be precise, which is the closest thing to respect I know how to offer. The blank sector remains on the register. It will not be relabeled. The chamber discussed relabeling it and decided unanimously that a label would invite interpretation, and interpretation would invite curiosity, and curiosity had a history in this part of the catalog. The blank sector is blank. The riders come quickly. The notation from the 6th Age cartographers remains in the margin in their angular script, and I find that I have stopped disagreeing with their interpretation of it. There is one more thing I will set down, and then I am done. In the weeks after the wreckage was recovered, I was permitted to review the navigational data. Not the recorder contents, only the positional data, the trajectory that had carried that hull fragment back across the line. The trajectory told me that the wreckage had not drifted. It had been placed. The calculations were too clean, too deliberate to be anything other than an intentional return. Something had sent it back, and the point of origin, extrapolated backward, corresponded to a position deep inside the blank sector, not at the border, deep inside. Whatever had ended, the Vorath fleet had not ended it at the threshold. It had allowed them to come in. It had waited, and then it had sent something back to show us that it had waited. I filed 17 objections. I am noting it again for whoever reads this. Someone said no. I am sealing this record now. If you are reading it, your clearance is sufficient, and you have been asked a question that requires this answer. I recommend you read it once. I recommend you do not ask to see the sealed material. I have been an archivist for a long time. The difference between knowledge that can be carried and knowledge that cannot. The blank sector is blank. That is the whole of what I have to tell you.